Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Sked. Thank you for joining us for today's show. We're going to start off by discussing about Brexit, and Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, has outlined plans that would see Northern Ireland stay in the European single market for goods, but would have to leave the customs union, then resulting in new customs checks. There have been obviously reactions both ways, with some members of the EU saying that this plan isn't as bad as they presumed any plan would be by Prime Minister Johnson, but others are obviously unsatisfied, including, most importantly, the Irish leadership as well. Beyond that, of course, is also this warning by Dominic Grieve, who is a former Attorney General, saying that Boris Johnson could very well declare a state of emergency to push through a no-deal Brexit if such a scenario were to arise. Is that a warning which is legitimate and fair? There will obviously be people on the other side who would say, no, that is not a fair warning, and that is simply overstating what may very well occur come October 31st, that deadline that, of course, Boris Johnson wants to stick to, do or die, as he would like to say. Let's discuss all of the above a bit further with our panelists. We're joined now by David Jeffery, who is a lecturer in British politics at the University of Liverpool. He's joining us now from Liverpool. Joining us from the British capital are Alan Sked and Tessa Glinoer. Alan is an emeritus professor of international history at LSE, formerly head of European studies there as well. Tessa is external affairs correspondent for the Henry Jackson Society. Tessa, Alan, and David, thank you all for your time this morning. Alan, I'd like to start with you. What did you make of Johnson's speech there at the Conservative Party conference? What do you make of his plan?
Well, I thought it was a very good speech. His plan is obviously controversial, but it has secured the backing of the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland and also of both wings of the Conservative Party. The ERG, the so-called Spartans, the hard Brexiteers, and also of the Tory rebels. So the chances are that if it came before Parliament, Johnson would have a majority. The question, of course, is whether the EU will accept the plan and whether the Parliament gets the right to vote on something that's an agreed solution to the problem.
And that's a good point, isn't it, Tessa? Because Parliament may very well along with this, but if the Irish leadership is anything to go by, then they're not very happy with this.
No, they're not happy with it. And I think Boris Johnson's speech at the conference was very good, and he was appealing to an audience of the EU rather than an audience of the Tory party members. But the one sticking point in his speech that he glossed over ambiguously was the border, and he just said it was a technical issue. And I think that was the weakest link in his speech. And as a result, the Irish aren't happy with what he had to offer. And the EU also feels that they need to protect better Ireland so that it gets to maximise the benefits of when the UK pulls out of the EU.
So then, David, it seems that one step back sort of situation, isn't it? Where, fine, you may very well have Parliament sign on to this deal, but then that doesn't really satisfy the EU as a whole, does it?
No, and if it doesn't, at least the benefit for Boris Johnson is that he has the benefit of the EU being seen to reject the deal. So he can say to Parliament, and he can say to the voters, more importantly, well, look, I tried. I gave it my best shot, something that I thought was fair. I brought on side the DUP. I brought on side the Spartans within my own party. We all agreed, and this was the EU's fault. And that would play quite well in a next general election, and especially when Boris Johnson goes up against Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party, he might not lose as many votes as he would have done otherwise. It also gives Boris a way of having to comply with the Benn Act, which forces him to ask for an extension from the EU without losing too much face, because he can say again, well, I put forward proposals, I'm now following the law, but if it's up to me, if you give me a majority government, we will leave with no deal. I've tried my best. The EU won't negotiate.
So, Alan, I wonder then, what do you think the EU's next move will be? Because they're saying, I believe, till October 17th, they want to continue discussions and see what comes around at that date. There isn't much wiggle room here, is there? I mean, or maybe there is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because Boris Johnson had said that this will be the final plan presented for Brexit.
Yes, I don't think he can go beyond the 31st of October deadline, so they've only got a limited amount of time to make an agreement. However, there is huge pressure now on the EU and particularly on Ireland to come around and make some kind of agreement, because people in Britain are obviously fed up with this process. It's gone on for long enough. And I can't see for the life of me what the advantage is to the EU of spinning this out for months or years further. So it may be that one of the heads of state of the EU will just say enough's enough and we're not granting an extension. But I mean, I think the chances are that there will be some concessions by the EU, but they'll have to be done in a way that doesn't take us beyond the 31st of October, because Boris has made it absolutely clear that he's not prepared to negotiate beyond that. The Britain must come out by the 31st of October. And if we don't come out by the 31st of October, he loses a great deal of credibility, and he is vulnerable, very vulnerable, to a major political challenge by Farage and the Brexit Party.
Tessa, I wonder, what your thoughts are about the very realistic, views on what Johnson would be able to achieve or not really in office as Prime Minister. Even the EU admitting this plan isn't really as bad as what they thought it may have been. So do you think he's actually delivered where he said he would?
Well, he hasn't delivered anything yet. And so far it's been a case of ambiguous, jargonistic, vague talk. Behind the scenes, I assume that there's been work going on with the EU. The EU, just to pick up on the earlier point made, the EU do want to deal. I do really believe that. And they said in the wake of Boris Johnson's speech regarding the Irish border that they would put point for point the reasons why the Irish border was not acceptable to them at this current time. So it's just a case of the government working side by side with a collaborative mindset with the EU, so that we can get out of the deal quick, so we can get to the deal or no deal faster. Boris Johnson has not proven himself, in my opinion, as of yet, because 31st of October hasn't come, the 19th of October hasn't come yet. It remains to be seen.
Okay, so David, what are your thoughts on that? Because, for day one of this entire Brexit process, to me at least, personally, it always seemed that it would be best to have somebody who is a Brexiteer, really, at the helm to take forward any process. And Boris Johnson, as we all know, of course, campaigned very heavily for Brexit to occur. Is this a good thing? Do you think that he's been able to do something in that regard? Or do you agree with Tessa that he hasn't really proven himself yet?
Well, Boris Johnson obviously was elected by the Conservative Party members on a policy of no deal no ifs, no buts, we leave on the 31st of October. So Tessa's right in the sense that up until the 31st of October, he can't prove whether he's going to fulfill the policy that he promised Conservative Party members. And I think you're right in the sense that the first 2.5 years of Brexit negotiations probably would have gone much more smoothly under a Prime Minister who actually genuinely believed in Remain, rather than Theresa May, who made a lot of right noises on it for the Conservative Party and for Leave voters. But ultimately, as in many other areas of domestic policy, she was too stubborn when it came to her own bill. And she made a lot of strategic errors that Boris Johnson probably also would have made, including not getting Labour Party support and buy-in early on during the negotiations, and the setting of far too many red lines that hemmed in the British negotiating team. But again, you're right, her negotiation team also were not believers in Brexit, and so it was something to be managed, whereas Boris Johnson talks about Brexit in a much more optimistic manner, and in a sense of this provides an opportunity, which voters find a lot more inspirational. But the problem could just be that he believes his own bluster and he gets caught up in saying everything will be great, but not actually taking on what experts are saying.
Okay, so Alan, what do you think about, at this point in time, possibly Johnson's legacy will be when it comes to Brexit? Do you think he'll be able to deliver in that regard? Obviously, it's been tough, and as our other guest mentioned, of course, this has been a long process, and Theresa May's she tried seemingly, but her heart wasn't set in this, at least from my point of view, because she didn't really actually campaign for Brexit at all to begin with when the campaign was occurring.
No, I don't think. Well, May saw it as a problem that had to be solved, and Boris sees it as a great opportunity. His final reputation will depend, of course, on A, whether he gets a deal, and B, if he successfully takes us out on the 31st of October in some way, despite the Benn Act. But the Remainers are now very, very tense and worried that we can maybe leave without a deal, and therefore you get Dominic Grieve raising a spectre of, a sort of civil contingency situation where an emergency is declared in Britain because of civil unrest, which is all nonsense, because I don't think the government would go that way in a million years.
Do you agree with that, Tessa? Because I wanted to, in fact, bring up the warning that Grieve had spoken, Dominic Grieve, that had raised about the possible declaration of a state of emergency, saying that things were headed in that direction, according to him. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are, that is the paranoia of a stateless politician, and that he's overemphasizing, over-exaggerating a threat that's really hearsay, and it's really nothing that's been evidenced, and that it's got no root in fact whatsoever, as far as I'm aware, as far as I've read, as far as the mainstream media is aware and the public is aware. So it's a very curious phenomenon as to his fixation on this particular threat, and I think he is just trying to undermine Boris Johnson's, what I believe are wholehearted and genuine attempts to get us out of the EU, do or die, by the 31st of October. Whether it's with a deal or without a deal, my reservations are very much inclined towards leaving without a deal. But I do believe in his integrity and his honesty in terms of trying to get us out of the EU. So I believe that Grieve's claims, exaggerated, emphasized claims, is a product and manifestation of paranoia.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but of course we appreciate David, Alan, and Tessa for their time this morning and for putting into context, of course, everything that's going around and the latest, of course, regarding Brexit. Certainly it's still confusing, but everyone agrees that Boris Johnson's plan is put forward seemingly isn't as bad as everyone may have thought any plan he would put forward would be. He's spoken, of course, in great detail in that plan about the Irish backstop and the whole Irish border issue to begin with. And of course, he's put forward certain, proposals in that regard in this plan. The Irish leadership themselves are not happy about this, saying that this does not go according to what they would be comfortable with and with the agreements that are in place at this point in time. Some members of the EU, though, seemingly are okay with this plan, but there does need to be further discussion as well. October 31st still very much remains the deadline. Are warnings then by Dominic Grieve about a possible state of emergency declaration by the Prime Minister Johnson to force through a no-deal Brexit on October 31st? Is that paranoia, as Tessa there said, or is this genuinely something that Johnson would actually look into? Possibly. A lot of Brexit drama still remaining, but as Alan had said, Brexit fatigue is certainly a reality, and I imagine Britons and the rest of us around the world really want to get this Brexit process over with for all of our sakes. We'll keep a very close eye on that Brexit process, though, here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss in this segment protests that have taken place in 3 major Middle Eastern countries, i.e. Lebanon, Egypt, and Iraq. And while I know, of course, that each of those countries has their individual respective situations, which cannot always be compared with each other, but it seems that at the core, at least, of many of these protests are basic issues such as the economy and corruption, mismanagement, etc. When we're talking about Lebanon, we can obviously talk about a long list of things, but it seems that the situation there is dire enough that we had widespread protests while not very, very large. In Egypt, we had this rare show of dissent during a tenure of Al-Sisi. That doesn't really happen very often, especially under the Al-Sisi rule ever since he's come in, since overthrowing Mohammed Morsi. And then in Iraq, we have now a curfew in place in the capital, Baghdad, and possibly in other places as well. Many people blaming the government there for overreaction, especially soldiers saying that, listen, we were told to protect the green zone at any cost. So I'd like to discuss all of those three countries, of course, issues with our esteemed panelists who are joining us now. We're joined by Zeidon Al-Kinani, who is a political analyst and writer. He specializes in geopolitics and identity politics with a primary focus on Iraq and the Middle East. He's joining us now from Doha. We're joined now by Kareem, Chehayeb, who is a Lebanese independent journalist and researcher. He's joining us now from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. And we're also joined by Osama Gaweesh, who is a well-known Egyptian journalist and TV broadcaster. He's joining us now from the British capital, London. Osama, Kareem, and Zeidon, thank you to all three of you for joining us. Osama, I'd like to start with you. Egypt, certainly, such protests are rare, especially, of course, under Al-Sisi. We know that we have that politician outside the country, or the businessman, pardon me, outside the country, Muhammad Ali, who led all of this and called for all of this outside the country. But do you think that the root causes, i.e. the economy, corruption, are something that the Al-Sisi government will actually address?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Waqar, for having me on this show. And let me start with some facts from 2013, from the bloody coup that Sisi took the power from President Morsi. President Sisi now have all the support from all the state organization, the military, the interior ministry, the media, the parliament. All of these organizations support Mr. Sisi. Also, the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, support him with more than $40 billion from the day one of the bloody coup in 2013. So he have all the causes to success, to be a successful president, to decrease the poverty rate. But unfortunately, the situation in Egypt is horrible now. We're talking about the political situation. There is no political life, no political parties, more than 60,000 political prisoners, and more than 400 journalists in jails. Reporter Without Borders issued a report talking about Egypt is the largest jail of journalists all over the world. We're talking about the economy. Muhammad Ali mentioned the poverty rate, mentioned the corruption, mentioned that Sisi asking the Egyptian people to sacrifice for the sake of the state, sacrifice and pay the money for the new capital and for these mega projects. But the fact is he and his wife and his children and his family live in that palace. And Muhammad Ali build him 5 villas and more than 2 palaces and cost the Egyptian people more than $3 billion. And Sisi appeared on the Youth Conference 3 weeks ago and say, I built a palace and I'm building and I will still build. So if we talk about the economic situation in Egypt, we're talking about the poverty rate. In 2013, it was 20%, and now it's in this year it's 32%. And so
Osama, if you allow me to come in, I just wanted to go on to Iraq as well. Of course, come back to you, and we'll continue to discuss because Zeidon, if we're talking about Iraq and the situation there. Again, it is corruption, and it's said that ever since the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in 2003, the government structure is such that corruption is almost just impossible to ignore, and it just occurs on a daily basis and is a regular reality of life for many Iraqis and even politicians just living off, be it money coming from the outside or money that's being made from within the country. What do you make of that, and how or not has the government tackled that?
Absolutely, Waqar. The Iraqi protests are based and triggered by poor public services, whether it be education, healthcare, social services. There are so many facts and figures that weren't improved but got worsened since 2003, with empty promises within every single election campaigns. The youth unemployment is 25%. People are protesting against corruption, militant and political sectarianism. There are around 2 million orphans in Iraq today, around 1.5 million internally displaced people from the ISIS war, which they took too long to end. There is a 96.4% of Iraqis that are without health insurance. There is only an Iraqi governmental-run public health care system with little advocacy or diversity of treatment options. Illiteracy in one of the most educated countries in the world today is 39% within the rural population. And as you mentioned, from a structural perspective, the ethnic sectarian quota in Iraq is installed by a US invasion in 2003, and it's still managed based on the interests of regional power players through their interest groups in Iraq, whether they be in the Iraqi government or whether they be the militias on the ground. Yeah. People are fed up by being governed by people they never really elected. There's an ethnic sectarian quota that forms the political negotiations after elections, regardless of whom got the highest votes in the elections. You could be the political coalition or party that got the highest votes in the polls, but you can end up being the opposition due to political negotiations and this very advanced parliamentary democracy that was enforced on the Iraqi people instead of having a presidential democracy to people who are new to democracy and elections. Looking at the events, closer, the protests are mainly in Baghdad, Nasiriyah, and Amara, and a few other provinces. It was unfortunately met by violent crackdown and heavy security measures since day one. The protest began on Tuesday, as you may know, on October 1st, but the security measures were prepared the day before. As you mentioned, a curfew was imposed in Baghdad and other southern cities. Government blocked all networks of communication, including the internet and apps such as WhatsApp, Facebook, and Twitter. And ironically, the day before that, the Iraqi Prime Minister, Adel Abdel Mahdi, promised to provide jobs to the youth. And the irony or the contradiction here is interesting, because he would promise jobs and better opportunities to the unemployed young people, but the day after that, he would deprive them from the right of having a voice, from their right of the freedom of movement on the streets. Another interesting factor to really...
If I may, Zeidon, I apologize for interrupting you, just because I wanted to, in fact, take some of the things that you've mentioned there to Kareem, because Kareem, you know, if we're talking about Lebanon, for example, and as we well know, its structure is also sectarian in many regards, its structure of governance, that is. And many people say that is the problem, where a lot of these politicians then use state resources for their own political benefits and then are reluctant to then, you know, talk about the issues. And in fact, it seems, at least, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Kareem, that many of the politicians in Lebanon are not actually addressing what the protesters' demands are and or concerns are. And this is all at a time that this government that was formed was, as we know, took a very long time to be able to form and to be agreed upon. And it seems that this too is just falling apart at its helm. So what are your thoughts?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, you know, when it comes to the issues of corruption, the misuse and misappropriation of public resources and funds, Lebanon is quite notorious for that. However, the new government has promised economic reforms. What these look like? Well, they're coming in the form of austerity measures and cutting government spending. And this is to unlock $11 billion in grants and loans from the international community, the IMF and the World Bank, in a series of conferences called the CEDAR conferences. Unfortunately, by the looks of this draft budget, which has been recently ratified by Parliament, many significant ministries, including the education and environment ministries, are receiving massive cuts. And people are extremely concerned now about just basic services. It's the same kind of topics that have been discussed in many civil society campaigns. But these riots sort of signify a bit of a different discourse than we've heard before. The protests that took place, they were small in size. There were just a few hundred people, but they managed to shut down most of the capital's traffic. They caused riots, roadblocks, and the protests reached Tripoli, where they were burning down posters of the prime minister. And that's one of his stronghold cities. So the discourse, I think, goes beyond sectarianism. It becomes an issue about resource and power sharing among the people. And I think a lot of people, despite having some sectarianism in their personal politics, are finding a common connection between things like education, social security, healthcare, electricity even. So this is, I think, the discourse that's developing in Lebanon, and it actually shows that this power sharing system might not be the ideal situation for good governance, especially if it's not providing basic services.
Okay, so then Osama, I wanted to now see if we can connect the really between all three of these countries and just across the Middle East, really, because, you know, the argument can be made that why are we seeing these sorts of Middle Eastern governments being unable to govern well? Where are they going wrong when it comes to the economy? Why aren't the people of these countries seeing economic benefits if their governments are telling them, listen, we're going to institute these austerity policies, you need to be patient, but then at the same time we're seeing leaders who are corrupt. Where has all this gone wrong, especially in the wake of the Arab Spring?
Yeah, because they have the power, they have the military, they have the police with them. They dealing with the people. They not have the ability to hear the people's voice, the politician's voice, the journalist voice. No, they dealing with the bullets. They dealing with the gas. They dealing with the army. That's we are facing in Egypt. That's we are facing in our countries. Because General Sisi, he mentioned himself last year during the presidential campaign in 2018. I'm not a politician. I don't understand in the politician and the political life. I'm an army man. So you are an army man. Go to the border, defeat our enemies, not govern our country. Muhammad Ali, what he did to Mr. Sisi, Waqar, that he destroyed the image. President Sisi tried to build an image that he's a nobleman, the guard who saved Egypt from the evil power and from the Muslim Brotherhood and from or this from Turkey and Qatar. But now all the Egyptian people know he's a liar. He take the people money and spent it on his life and his family and his son. The other thing now, the speech of the Egyptian regime is change. It's significant change. They're talking about we will not cutting the subsidies again, and we hear your voice. We need a political life. We need the political parties again, and that's a horrible change in the Sisi regime because he's talking. Only I have a power and the parliament with me, the media with me. I don't need any other voice. But now, no, he have some step back, and he now need to hear other voice.
Okay, we have unfortunately run out of time, but of course we'll try to have all of you back on to continue this conversation. Certainly we've only just touched the tip of the iceberg, and as I said, I understand of course that each of these countries has their individual situations, but I do see many commonalities in what's going wrong. I'll thank Zeidon, Kareem and Osama for their time today and for of course shedding light on Iraq, Lebanon and Egypt for us and putting into context of course their individual situations to the extent that they were able to for myself and our viewers. Viewers, the main issue seems to, of course, be the basics, aren't they? The likes of corruption, economic mismanagement, etc. And this seems to be something which, again, is odd that it's happening in the wake of the Arab Spring, where in the Arab Spring we were told all of this democratic movement would be good for the peoples of the region. But that doesn't seem to be how it's worked out. In fact, governments seem to be becoming ever more repressive and, or in the case of Lebanon, in certain cases, just ignoring almost the people's demands. In Iraq now, we have a curfew in place. In Egypt, we have an even more repressive government in place than was promised really to the Egyptian people in the wake of what happened with the fall of Mubarak there. So what's really happening when it comes to this major vacuum of good leadership in not just those Middle Eastern countries, but across the region, really? We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with my next segment after this break. Thanks for staying with us, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Twitter and a revelation that's come out that the head of its editorial for the Middle East North Africa region is also a part-time officer in the UK's 77th Brigade, British Army's 77th Brigade, I should say, which is an information warfare unit which has worked on behavioral change projects in that region. Now, Twitter itself is unapologetic about this whole thing, saying that we actively encourage all of our employees to pursue external interests, while the UK Ministry of Defence said that the 77th Brigade had no relationship with Twitter other than using it for communication. Now, how is that possible when a Twitter executive is also a part-time UK British Army officer involved in information warfare? How is that sort of a relationship okay? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. David Lowe, who is a senior research fellow at Leeds Beckett University Law School. He's joining us now from Liverpool. We're also joined by Klarenberg, who is an investigative journalist documenting state crimes against democracy. He's joining us now from Leipzig in Germany. Kit and David, thank you both for your time today. Kit, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this revelation? Everyone involved seems to be quite unapologetic about it.
Well, this raises a number of very serious questions about, well, the independence of Twitter for a start, and actually, what purpose and whose interests that the allegedly independent platform serves. So, I mean, for instance, the social network makes a big deal about cracking down on state-backed, foreign-run accounts carrying out information operations, quote unquote, on Twitter. And yet they don't seem particularly concerned when one of their senior executives is not only working for a rather secretive British military operation which specifically seeks to conduct information operations on Twitter, but is also actively promoting the unit on his own Twitter account. So dating back to when 77th Brigade launched in January 2015, Gordon Macmillan is posting posting a number of articles about its launch, and specifically refers to it as a Twitter brigade. Now, bearing in mind that a Twitter brigade will almost inevitably entail the creation of fake accounts, surely, like Gordon is aware of this, and what's more, will be providing the social network with his skills and expertise and insider knowledge. Indeed. How this isn't an issue and a massive conflict of interest, I don't know.
David, what are your thoughts on that? Because, again, to me, it just makes sense. I mean, for Twitter to then claim that, listen, we're independent and none of this really affects us, it does affect it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I understand yours and Kit's concerns there that you've got a senior executive of Twitter who's also an army reservist for the 77th Brigade. And of course, it's going to raise questions, but I sort of look at it from the purpose of the 77th Brigade. We look at different types of warfare, and one warfare is over communications. And you can see why the 77th Brigade and other states who've got similar outfits have been formed, because you look at 6 years ago, just over 6 years ago, when Daesh was starting to proclaim its caliphate because it had the territory. You look at how effective they were, not just with Twitter, but all forms of communication in getting out their narrative. And it was certainly a thing that I was identifying at that time, is it's time that we need to get out a counter-narrative. I just think it's obviously one of those things where you have a chief executive of Twitter who's linked with this brigade. But I think, we look at this sort of this new form of statecraft, which is essential, because you look at other states who've been using it. Maybe Twitter, it's hard to accept this day and age, but maybe Twitter's not seeing a conflict of interest. But I certainly would be happier if Twitter did investigate this, because it is important. I think most of us all use it, and we do think it's independent. But I think we've got to get that balance right as well, and let's not get too carried away with this brigade and its purpose.
Okay. We're also joined now by Piers Robinson, who is a co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. He's joining us now from London. Piers, thank you for your time this morning. What do you make of this, Piers? Because, again, there is that concern, isn't there, of conflict of interest here, and the overlap, certainly, between Gordon Macmillan's role with the 77th Brigade as well as his role at Twitter.
Well, I think, as your other guests have pointed out, there is a clear conflict of interest. The fact that he holds that position, and it's obviously a very powerful and influential position in relation to Twitter, and the fact that he also is working essentially in a UK government propaganda operation, it's an obvious conflict of interest. I think nobody objective individual sitting looking at this would come to any other conclusion. I think so. There's an obvious conflict of interest. I think what we have here is an indication, really, of quite how blatant propaganda activities are becoming in Western democracies. And of course, the whole 77th Brigade links into the issue of the Integrity Initiative, the documents which were released a year ago, which indicated that the government was orchestrating a very broad-ranging propaganda campaign, which involved creation of clusters. And these clusters were designed to incorporate journalists and academics and other political commentators into essentially sort of specific sort of mindset regarding foreign policy and regarding British stance towards, for example, Russia. Now, so when you're co-opting and bringing in journalists and academics and so on, that's a very, very invasive form of propaganda, and it's very corrupting with respect to the public sphere. And I think what we've just seen with Twitter is an excellent example of this, and of really how problematic this has all become.
Kit, I wonder what you make of David's warning that we overstate things, because I certainly do agree with that. I want to take a balanced view on this. So if we're putting this into context, Kit, of the fact that ISIS did use social media to its advantage at the beginning days, of course, and that has disastrous results, of course, especially for the people in the Middle East region, of course. Do you think that there needs to be a balance found of, okay, you do need people who are in place to be able to control what is said online, certainly, but possibly maybe that's not the role of governments?
I mean, I'd like to know more about why he doesn't think this should be overstated. I mean, this is a really, really severe scandal, and I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Daesh propaganda. In some of Gordon Macmillan's other posts are kind of attack alleged Russian use of Twitter for information operations. Yes, like like ISIS's use of Twitter for information operations. And obviously suggesting that this is a big deal and that like fake accounts are a major issue, and yet he doesn't seem so concerned about doing exactly the same thing himself. So I think there's an element of the hypocrisy here. And going back to what I was saying earlier about thinking about in whose interest Twitter serves, like. I made this point in an article I wrote about it. I wrote about this the other day. Mm-hmm. Over the past year or so, Twitter has carried out several kind of mass purges of foreign accounts. Not once have they targeted an English-speaking country. It's all and typically it's states which are the kind of enemies of the American empire. So what they're effectively saying there is it's okay when we do it. But if anyone else does it, it's this egregious abuse of our platform and will be dealt with in the most robust way. It's also interesting to note that most of these accounts that have been banned over the past year would fall under his remit as head of editorial for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa.
Indeed. David, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I, of course, want to get your thought on what Kit there said. And I also wanted to add this on even myself. My own Twitter account's been suspended, and I've, in fact, been banned from Twitter because I once worked at Press TV in Tehran. And that apparently just labels me, and stains me forever. What do you make of that? Because then again, it puts into doubt then, doesn't it, Twitter's claim that, listen, you can actually have free discussions via our platform.
Yeah, I think you're quite right, Waqar. I mean, as you said there, you've had your account that was closed, and I think one of the absolute key problems with most forms of social media are the algorithms and how they're registering what's a threat and what's not, and then with the human eyes that's going with it and making that decision. And I think this is something that's got to be examined and got to be looked at. But I think we just can't say, well, let's everyone have their say. I think states have a responsibility to give a counter-narrative. And we're not just talking about the Middle East. I'm looking at it globally. I'm looking at all forms of extremism that influence people to carry out acts of violence. I'm talking about far-right groups. We only have to look at what happened in Christchurch earlier this year to see how Facebook was basically violated. And you look at the international response that was given to that individual, Tarrant, who was carrying out, allegedly, he hasn't been tried, allegedly carried out those attacks. So we have to look at that and we have to get the balance. I mean, I was saying this, I do also have concerns that, a company like Twitter does look, are they being compromised by a position, by an individual in such a high position? So they have to get that balance right. But I think, let's not start condemning, if you like, Western values. We've seen Russia, who's been involved in creating many fake accounts. And this is a new area that we have to deal with, but let's do it in a manner that is acceptable.
All right, so Piers, this goes to the heart of the problem, because it pretty much means that social media is really complex in the sense that you have narratives, counter-narratives, you have back-and-forth conversations. So do you agree that governments too, be it the UK or be it other governments around the world, deserve their space as well? On a platform like Twitter, to present their narratives in as forceful and strong a way as they so please?
Well, obviously, it's perfectly acceptable for any government to promote issues and what it wants the public to know about, and to do that in an open and transparent way. That's acceptable for any actor in a public sphere in a democracy to do that. The issue here, the first point is, in terms of sort of looking at extremism and counter-extremism, Western governments are heavily involved already in propaganda activities across social media and across the mainstream media. So the idea that the Western governments aren't already engaging this is inaccurate. That, in fact, Western governments are arguably one of the biggest sources of propaganda and information campaigns globally. So it's certainly not the case that Western governments are sort of benign in all of this, and as it were, struggling to catch up. They're probably very much ahead of the game. But I think the most important thing here is that to go down the road essentially of censorship, which is what this scandal with Twitter indicates, is a very dangerous road to go down for precisely the reasons which Kit spelled out, is that you have ultimately powerful actors, governments will seek to manipulate the information environment to their advantage. They will use, for example, the threat of extremism in order to justify censorship and manipulation of information, which then serves other interests. The solution to this is not to go down the algorithm censorship road. The solution is to go down the road of media literacy and giving people the skills and the skill set to sift through information and decide which information they believe is trustworthy and that which is not. And there's plenty of studies and work being done on media literacy. That is the way to tackle these problems, the problems which have been described regarding extremism. The way not to do it is to engage in censorship, because that just plays into the hand, ultimately, of propaganda operations by governments.
All right, we'll leave there as a final word, gentlemen, but of course we do appreciate all of your insight and of course the context that you provided to this conversation. That was Piers, David, and Kit speaking to us there, respectively, and of course for sharing their thoughts on this topic. It's an important topic, isn't it, viewers? Because again, this goes to the heart of the theory, really, that all these social media platforms are meant to be platforms where you can have free speech and you can have a back and forth and you can be confronted with different people's viewpoints in an open exchange of ideas. And that doesn't seem to be now what's really happening. Because on the one hand, we have a Twitter executive who's part of the 77th Brigade of the UK, an information warfare unit of the British Army, whose entire goal can possibly be defined as propaganda. Others would say there is no other way to define that but as propaganda. They're allowed to do as they please, seemingly. But then other Twitter users, even in Egypt, in fact, with these protests taking place there, have been banned simply for posting about the Egyptian protests, targeting the El-Sisi government. How does that exactly work in parallel or in conjunction with Twitter's claims that it does allow for free speech? Or maybe it just doesn't. We'll keep a very close eye on that. And of course, social media's ever-evolving role in the world of politics as well. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.